So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. So we have two, Stephanie Boluk and Patrick LeMieux. They are both currently assistant professors in the Cinema and Digital Media program and English department at UC Davis. Stephanie's research, of course, explores video games, but also beyond that, namely looking at alternative currencies and financializations, and ultimately looking at how leisure and labor are converging in today's information society. Patrick, who besides being an academic also works as an artist and a game designer, he's interested in community histories and material traces that play leave, especially through digital technologies during the 21st century. And they came to us to talk about Metagame. So the idea is, you all heard about the magic circle, right? You play a game and you enter kind of this space. But what happens while you're not playing, while other people are visiting and watching what you're playing? And so let's welcome Stephanie and Patrick. And the talk is titled Breaking the Metagame, 17 Seconds of Dota 2.
Thank you. I think this is actually going to be a really nice follow-up to the Magic Circle.
Yeah, so thank you, Ingmar, for the introductions. And we also like to thank the Interactive Media and Game Seminar, MediaX, Stanford University, as well as Ingmar and Henry, who invited us to come talk today. So we're currently just finishing, we're on like the last page of a book called Metagaming, Video Games and the Practice of Play that we've been writing for the last 5 years. But today we're going to focus on a small case study from the end of the book based on Valve's popular video game and esport Dota 2. So this is a part of a longer work on the history of statistical and probabilistic play, which moves from 18th century wargaming to the history of Dota and Valve's economic experiments in virtual economies. But instead of covering hundreds of years, today we decided we only had time for about 17 seconds. So we're going to begin with an overview of the term metagame, and then we'll transition and maybe set up the speakers, and then talk about Dota and how Valve has built its economic infrastructure by essentially colonizing these metagames. So before we do that, what exactly do we mean when we say metagame?
So the word metagame, it doesn't actually appear in any dictionary, and although it's been used to refer to a wide variety of activities that are related to games, from the slippage between in-game and out-of-game knowledge in the tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, to the common strategies or passing fashions surrounding competitive card games, there's actually no unified definition of metagame. Before it was taken up as a concept in Richard Garfield's design for Magic: The Gathering, the earliest concatenation of meta and game occurred within Nigel Howard's research in mathematical game theory. So game theory, or the study of mathematical models of conflict and cooperation between intelligent, rational decision makers, was popularized by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in 1944. And it also significantly influenced both US and USSR policies on nuclear arms proliferation during the Cold War. So one of game theory's most famous thought experiments is the prisoner's dilemma. So what's the prisoner's dilemma? It goes something like this. Two prisoners are arrested for the same offense. They're held separately and given a choice to betray one another with 3 outcomes. If one confesses to the crime, that one will go free. If one confesses to the crime, or rather sells his other opponent out, that one will go free, and one will be punished. If both confess, both get punished. But if neither confesses, both prisoners go free. So it's a paradox that's based on mutual trust versus rational decision making. And although it's in the best interest of everybody to remain silent, the risk of not confessing is, at least mathematically, too much of a gamble. So imagine a version of the prisoner's dilemma in which confessing is replaced with dropping an atomic bomb. So for game theorists, the Cold War represents a global prisoner's dilemma with potentially apocalyptic consequences, considering the disturbing fact that the rational decision, confessing, would result in mutually assured destruction. The only way to win this logical paradox is not to play. So, not satisfied with either opting out or this form of rational suicide, in his 1971 book, Paradoxes of Rationality, Nigel Howard attempted to solve the prisoner's dilemma based on a non-quantitative and non-rational approach to game theory, and he called it the metagame, or the game that would exist if one of the players chose his strategies after the others in knowledge of their choices. So whereas in the original dilemma, there's only two options, to confess or to not confess, according to Howard's metagame theory, player one can also make additional extensive choices that are based on player two's possible actions. So what player one thinks player two will do. By projecting an opponent's potential behavior, the simple decision to confess or to not confess exponentially multiplies into 4 new meta choices. Confess if they confess, don't confess if they don't confess if they don't confess, and don't confess if they confess. So this becomes a game theory within a game theory. And considering the implications of this metagame from player two's perspective, the projected possibilities then exponentially branch again from a metagame with 4 choices to a metagame with 16 choices. When player one's meta choices are cross-referenced with player two's meta choices, Howard shows that additional points of meta-rational meta-equilibrium appear and offer alternative favorable outcomes, i.e. not confessing. So basically, Howard proposes a mathematical solution to the problem of mutually assured destruction based on mutually assured metagaming. So John von Neumann, he's famous for declaring, if you say, why not bomb them tomorrow, I say, why not today? And game theory mathematically reinforced his militant belief in nuclear armament, if not preemptive nuclear strike. Von Neumann's game theory and Howard's metagame analysis may seem kind of very far afield from game studies and even further afield from game design, but the distinction between a game that's defined by an individualistic, selfish form of abstract rationality versus a metagame which acknowledges the collective historical conditions of policymaking is actually directly related to Richard Garfield's game design philosophy and ultimately the strategic mind games of esports players, as we'll see shortly in the example of Dota 2.
And so although the stakes are far less consequential than nuclear apocalypse, Richard Garfield's investment in the metagame began with his decision to stop backstabbing his friends in Diplomacy, a classic strategy game. So after treating each game of Diplomacy as an individual autonomous conflict, and losing more and more as he earned the reputation for being an ass, Garfield realized that the metagame actually matters. In a presentation at the Game Developers Conference in 2000, Garfield defined the metagame as, quote, how the game interfaces beyond itself, unquote, and argued that, quote, there is, of course, no game without a metagame. A game without a metagame is like an idealized object in physics. It may be a useful construct, but it doesn't really exist. So this is the first documented definition of the metagame as a game design concept versus its use in game theory. For Garfield, metagames are when and where games happen, not a magic circle within which unnecessary obstacles and voluntary pursuits play out, but a messy circle, a material circle that both constrains and makes possible games in the first place. So the term metagame is a signifier for everything occurring before, after, between, and during games, as well as everything located in, on, around, and through games. So like prepositions are to parts of speech, the metagame anchors the game in time and space.
So over the past decade, and with the rise of social media and sharing services like Steam, YouTube, and Twitch TV, the term metagame has become more commonly used to describe the community practices within, around, outside, and about video games. So when Narcissa Wright, you want to just click that? Yeah. So when Narcissa Wright speedruns The Legend of Zelda, her addition of optional constraints, like a simple timer and splits, radically changes the way the game is played. Speedrunning is not only a metagame that's contingent on the virtuosic performance of real-time play, but it's also a community practice that's based on discovering exploits like geometry clipping, cutscene skipping, sequence breaking, and memory manipulation. These are games within the game. Other players recover the histories of shifting strategies and tournament trends around specific video games as a playful and productive form of spectatorship. This is a game around the game. So, for example, again, Richard Terrell, he encodes VHS tapes to track the history of competitive Super Smash Brothers because, as he writes, every game with a metagame worth understanding deserves a devoted video game historian. And similarly, Daniel Artosis Stemkovsky studies and commentates Korean StarCraft because the metagame is not the same everywhere. Korea, China, North America, and Europe each have their own metagame. So the metagame can also be taken, or it can also take the form of a game outside the game. And this is the case with Alex Gianturco and Sean Smith when they expanded their EVE Online empire via cyber warfare and offline espionage. So what they identified as the metagame, which doesn't require booting the program up at all. And then there's someone like Andy Bao who observes that the term metagame can also refer to playable games about video games. And this is actually a definition of metagame that recalls the use of meta in other media genres like metafiction or metafilm. So when Jonathan Blow appropriates the tropes of Donkey Kong and Braid, he's making a self-reflexive game about games. And then finally, even the work of Anita Sarkeesian and her campaign to speak out against discrimination operates at the level of a metagame. And so I think this is why it's really important to remember that the metagame also includes the more toxic elements of video game culture.
So video games are not just bundles of disembodied information. They're not completely consumable forms of entertainment, not packaged products divorced from context or utopian escapes into immersive virtual spaces. Every video game is surrounded and supported by metagames. So as Garfield says, the metagame is how the video game interfaces with life. Attitude, affinity, experience, achievement, status, money, community, opponents, strategies, tournaments, series, and spectatorship. The metagame explodes the logic of the game, escaping the formal autonomy of both rules, ideal rules, and utopian play via those phenomenological, psychological, economic, material, and historical factors not immediately enclosed within the game. So the metagame reinforces the fact that the specific historical, gendered, class, and race conditions of play can never be ignored, and in fact, they're essential to play. So what's at stake here is the same thing at stake in Howard's argument against the ideological assumptions of Cold War game theory. What the metagame identifies is not the history of the game, a history of dates, dollars, and demographic data, but the history of play. So you change the metagame, and you change the game. And one of the most complex and influential metagames is occurring around Valve's Dota 2, a Warcraft 3 mod that became an international esport that's changing the way that that company does business.
In the last weekend of 2012, the audience that was assembled at Benaroya Hall, they weren't enjoying the Seattle Symphony perform The Pines of Rome. They hadn't gathered to watch an Indigo Girls concert or come to see Ira Glass reinvent the radio. Rather, leaning forward, spines straightening and hands moving to meet mouths, the spectators in Seattle were caught up in the turn of the tide. On the stage, inside two enormous glass boxes, were teams of professional players packed behind LCD screens. Heads were entombed in noise-canceling headphones, and fingers flicked mechanical keyboards and multi-button mice. Hanging above the booths, massive movie screens displayed electronic performances alongside live commentary and statistical analysis that was taking place in 3 languages. The audience cheered from stuffed chairs, waving iPads in lieu of pennants, and silk banners streamed from box seats, billowing in the air conditioning at the International, Valve Corporation's $1.6 million Dota 2 tournament.
So, and just for some context, in 2012, $1.6 million was a record-breaking amount of tournament money for an electronic sport or esports tournament. But over the last few years and last summer especially, however, Valve crowdsourced the prize pool for the International in 2015, and that number jumped from what at the time was an amazing $1.6 million to a jaw-dropping $18.5 million. So the winningest video game players are now taking home more money than professional athletes at the US Masters or Wimbledon. So for the past 2 years, the event has been held at Key Arena, a sports stadium that can hold about 17,000 people. And last summer, tickets sold out in less than 5 minutes. And we know because we spent like 30 minutes on Ticketmaster refreshing with no luck. But we weren't alone, and over 30 million people watched online and in bars like the one we ended up in San Jose. So if Dota 2 is any indication, we're currently living in a world where more eyes are on the championships of competitive video games than Major League Baseball's World Series and the NBA Finals, each of which had about 15 million viewers this year. So in 2015, esports are approaching World Cup numbers. Not quite the Super Bowl, but good enough for the Super Bowl of esports. So that's you, Steph.
Okay. So out of the 100 of hours of tournament proceedings, 17...
Actually.
Oh, sorry. It's the sound thing. I'm all messed up now. So I guess just a little bit of context here. Getting back to Dota 2 in 2012, as the tournament's name implies, the International features 16 5-player teams from around the world that are digitally duking it out within Valve's remake of Defense of the Ancient, or Dota, a game that began as a fan-produced mod of Blizzard's Warcraft 3. At the International in 2012, pro gamers coming from Sweden, Germany, Ukraine, Russia, China, Malaysia, Singapore, and Australia, they not only competed for the $1 million cash prize, but they were hoping to kickstart a professional game-playing career through Dota 2. And so, again, just for some context, this was a game that hadn't even made it out of beta that summer. So millions of dollars are at stake in a game that isn't even officially released, technically, to the public. So out of the 100 hours of tournament proceedings, in 2012, 17 seconds stand out. During the winners bracket semifinals, the Ukrainian team Navi, and their star player, Daniil Dendy Ishutin, competed against Invictus Gaming, IG, a Chinese team with an intimidating track record that was led by Wang Hok Chuan. So Navi, they were the clear fan favorites. The beloved Ukrainians were defending champions, they were internet celebrities, and rags to riches Dota millionaires. And this was because they'd won the first international tournament the previous year in 2011. So given that year's influx of utterly dominant teams from China, for the second annual tournament, the Ukrainian champions had been recast as the underdogs. They were the last foreign hope after all the Europeans and US teams had been defeated. In the prelims, the 5 Chinese teams seemed unbeatable. And by the actual tournament brackets, not much had changed. The first games between IG and Navi, the first one, it took only 16 minutes. It was a 16-minute, 15-second stomp. IG basically crushed Navi, and it looked like this last foreign hope had failed their fans. So this was interpreted in terms of Navi's failure rather than IG's success. The shoutcasters and the statisticians alike, they all felt robbed by this anticlimactic first game. Throughout the International and in Dota 2 more generally, Western teams are often described in terms of risky, aggressive play styles. In the eyes of Western fans, these teams are spectator-friendly, and they make for exciting matches. And by contrast, the rhetoric at the International characterized Chinese and East Asian teams as passive, as patient, and predictable. In other words, boring. The Chinese teams, largely unknown to English audiences at the time, were described as anonymous agents of some red machine that was grinding away behind the Great Firewall. So over the years, racialized terms like farming and ricing have become common ways to describe the long-term, economy-driven strategies that are associated with Chinese play. And to this effect, more than one racist meme has appeared on online forums. During IG's victory over Navi in Game 1, commentator David Luminous Zhang joked The Chinese have about 2,000 years of farming experience, so they have to be leading here. As commentators and spectators alike attempted to generate compelling frame narratives on the fly, the often inscrutable and intensely complex teamwork that was taking place on the screen was reduced to cultural stereotypes and racism. Media theorist Lisa Nakamura has argued that early accounts of the internet stressed its utopian, democratic potential for erasing or at least hiding race and creating a level playing field. But as you can see, the International makes it clear that there's nothing post-racial about Dota 2.
And the International not only demonstrated the techno-orientalist image economies in which the commentators trafficked, but it also revealed the deep tension between esports as a spectator sport and as a numbers-driven pursuit of wins, which, of course, results in profit. So beneath the surface of spectacular software, amidst the currents of international currency, and caught up in the undertow of tacit racism, in Game 2 of the winners bracket semifinals between IG and Na'Vi, right after they got stomped in like 16 minutes flat, the tide was about to turn. So in less than 17 seconds, the crowd's response moved from agitation to elation. And so bear with us, everybody with the audio.
Yeah.
They storm up the river. Patience from Zoe. Waiting in the wings. Navi's about to be caught. Oh, there's the sleep. The surge. He catches everyone. Oh, this could be a total disaster. Vacuum in. Ravage on everyone. The black hole as well. Light of heaven turns it around. Ravage as well. Stolen by Dendy. Are you kidding me? They turn it around. 4 heroes dead.
5 heroes dead. Chuan trying to survive. Chuan's gonna go down. Puppy talked about the Naga counter. It's Light of Heaven. What's this BKB? They turn it around. I don't even know how they're gonna do it. Standing ovation from the crowd.
Okay. So what exactly are they watching?
They storm up the river. Patience from Zoe. Waiting in the wings. Navi's about to be caught. Oh, there's the sleep. The surge. He catches everyone. Oh, this could be a total disaster. Vacuum in. Ravage on everyone. The black hole as well. Light of heaven turns it around. Ravage as well. Stolen by Dendy. Are you kidding me? They turn it around. 4 heroes dead.
5 heroes dead. Chuan trying to survive. Chuan's gonna go down. Puppy talked about the Naga counter. It's Light of Heaven. What's this BKB? They turn it around. I don't even know how they're gonna do it. Standing ovation from the crowd.
So against all odds, the Ukrainian team Na'Vi seems to reverse a tournament-losing ambush in the river into a reverse team kill. So here's a composite video that includes the team's booth. Like, what are the players doing during all of this?
So one more time.
They storm up the river. Patience from Zoe. Waiting in the wings. Navi's about to be caught. Oh, there's the sleep. The surge. He catches everyone. Oh, this could be a total disaster. Vacuum in. Ravage on everyone. The black hole as well. Light of heaven turns it around. Ravage as well. Stolen by Dendy. Are you kidding me? They turn it around. 4 heroes.
So Dendy's gonna jump up here and scream at Chuan as he destroys him down there, and Chuan's body kind of lights in fire as he like takes out his headphones and starts like berating his team.
I don't even know how they're gonna do it. Standing ovation from the crowd.
So the tournament was also broadcast in 3 languages, and so here's the perspective in Russian.
Ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой-ой. Ой, боже, обходят спину команду Нави. Так, IG, обходят, сон. Лос БКПшечка же, лос БКПшечка, лос БКПшечка. Да, безра, 3-4, Сасан! БКП хапана, -5! Вот это драка! Трипл килл от Дэнди! Вот это домой! Вот молодцы Нави! Ломай трон!
So, completely awash in emotion. I'm feeling emotional, actually. Russian shoutcaster Viat loses his voice completely, breaking into these choked sobs as he watches his team turn it around. And finally, let's hear the perspective from the Chinese commentators.
This is the last one.
好了，就看这一波，看这一波，看这一波，谜团是首当其冲的。大招一放，全部睡起来，拉在一块儿，挑起一个大招，投入，这次谜团也知道。哪位刷屏了？哪位刷屏了？哪位竟然刷屏了？这一波。
So whereas the English and Russian casters are working themselves into a frenzy, literally like specks of spit flying out of their mouths, the Chinese commentators are sitting in a stunned silence after seeing this reverse all kill. This is dead air hanging over their completely drowned team. So despite the differing emotional responses based on obvious national allegiances, the question still remains, what the hell is happening here? Like, what is this? What's actually going down? Why is this such an exciting moment? How did IG mess up, and what strategy did Navi exploit to turn it around? Did the virtuosic play of pro gamers reverse an outcome of the match, or did the deterministic microtemporal processes of technological media overshadow the players' agencies? And finally, how do these 17 seconds play into Valve's corporate interests in China? The answer for us is in the metagame.
So in esports like Dota, the term metagame is regularly used by players, commentators, and spectators to refer to the popular strategies, the tournament trends, and psychological mind games structuring the competition around the technical and mechanical processes of video games. The metagame in this case is the game around the game. So before even logging on, the metagame is already at play. And Dota 2's metagame is most evident in its draft phase. So in the draft phase, each team's captain begins by banning and picking not players, but characters from the game's massive roster. So at the time of the International in 2012, there were 92 heroes who had at least 4 special abilities and who could make use of the game's 138 items. So put this all together, and that's actually an almost inconceivable range of statistical variation. Dota 2's draft phase offloads game design decisions to the players as they collectively balance the game according to an ever-evolving metagame. So it's not the video game or the software, but rather the metagame which determines what kind of Dota will be played. So in Game 2 of the Winners Bracket semifinals, IG planned to adhere to that summer's dominant metagame, in which a character named Naga Siren and a character named Darkseer were regarded as an overpowered pair. They were able to unleash a wombo combo that was game-winning by combining their particular abilities. So this Siren Seer metagame is all too evident in the statistics for the International. Out of those 92 heroes, the top 3 banned and picked throughout the entire tournament were Darkseer at 155 times and Naga Siren, who tied with Rubik, who we'll see a little bit later, at 152. So it is not a coincidence that these heroes saw the most action during the draft phase of the International in 2012. And knowing all of this, it must have looked odd when Navi, seemingly unfazed by the loss of Game 1, did not actually pick or ban either Naga Siren or Darkseer at the start of Game 2. So clearly disappointed by all this, the English commentator L.D. Gorman actually reacts to Navi's decision saying, "For anybody who doesn't know, Naga's Song of the Siren obviously puts everyone to sleep. You can then vacuum them up with Darkseer while they're asleep, drop Darkseer's wall of replica, unleash the pain train. Oh God, if they give up the Tidehunter, how do you take a fight? You don't take a fight." So considering their swift defeat in Game 1, Navi's picks looked positively suicidal. Yet, the footage of the team gathered together in their glass box shows the Ukrainians grinning ear to ear and giggling mischievously. I actually think that's the definition of a shit-eating grin. So they know. Light of Heaven and Havost crowded around their captain's computer as Puppy picked the Juggernaut, who was an unconventional hero. He'd been picked and banned only 10 times during the entire tournament. And so again, compare that to Darkseer's 155 times. With Navi's third pick out of the way, there was only one option for IG, as L.D. Gorman says, the Tidehunter. Tidehunter has a powerful ultimate ability that's called Ravage, which can stun a whole team if they're clustered together, and it's often used to initiate team fights. So having seized the opportunity to select an unbanned Naga Siren and Darkseer, IG's choice seemed obvious. within the specific metagame of this year and this tournament and this series and this match against this team, how could picking the Tidehunter go wrong? Well, to understand how Navi turned the tide, we actually have to dive beneath the spectacular surface of that play and look at the series of events taking place on a microtemporal scale.
So after videos of the turn of the tide, and people still refer to this moment as the play, after videos of the turn of the tide made waves across the internet in 2012, Michael Krukauer typed host timescale 0.001, host frame rate 1000 into Dota 2's command line before replaying the .dem or demo file for that particular match. So instead of a real-time record, what followed was a microtemporal version of the turn of the tide. Like high-speed film appears in slow motion when played back at 30 or 60 frames per second, Krukauer rendered the sub-second record of mouse clicks and key presses of all 10 players in Dota 2 at 1,000 frames a second. So whereas the commentators at the International could not cope with the density of pixels, polygons, and particle effects erupting in that 17 seconds that the teams collided in the river, the glacial images of Krukauer's decelerated replay tell a different story. So the play begins when IG executes their big wraparound gank, an attack that catches Navi by surprise and pinches the Ukrainians between IG's defensive towers. Zoe initiates the aquatic ambush with Naga Siren's ultimate ability, a powerful song that locks the enemy team into invulnerable slumber. And so you can see that the members of Navi are all trapped in these kind of whirls of blue music notes. Navi are frozen, but importantly, they're also physically immune from taking any damage. Right? They can't get hurt while they're asleep. So at this point, Dark Seer, the spiky purple guy who's rushing in at the bottom of the scene, he uses vacuum to suck Navi all into one centralized position.
So
here's the vacuum.
Yeah. So now that everything's ready, and you can see here that Navi are being sucked into the middle of the screen. At this point, crucially, Naga Siren must manually click to stop singing before the Chinese team can enact their death blow and take the team fight. So between the Song of the Siren and the Tidehunter's 2.77 second area of effect stun Ravage, there emerges a small yet critical window. And there's a half second that Navi can exploit due to the timescale of human reflexes and the delay of team coordination. So while their avatars are immobilized by the sleep spell and IG's gearing up to land their wombo combo, the Ukrainians, they must mash at this point. So what Navi is wagering is that they can rapidly tap a single button faster than Zoe and Faith from IG can coordinate their syncopated spells. Even if a key press lands one frame before Song of the Siren ends, the next quick tap should still occur before Faith can begin Ravage. So Faith, on the other hand, can't button mash. Rather, Faith must time a single decisive tap with microtemporal scales of precision. So 0.46 seconds after the Naga Siren ceases her siren song, and as the Tidehunter's tentacles begin to spread across the screen, this is where Navi breaks the metagame by becoming a machine. The series of actions that follow, these are sort of one of the most memorable moments in the history of not just Dota, but probably the history of esports.
So as the red, this is the moment. As the red juggernaut, all of Navi are kind of mashing. And so they unleash their moves before the Tidehunter can unleash his Ravage. And so the red juggernaut at the top of the screen is spinning, and the blue enigma in the middle of the screen slowly rotates and begins to glow gold in the center. This is when the Grand Magus Rubik, who's being piloted by Dendi, deploys a force staff to scoot outside the reach of the Tidehunter's Ravage. So I think here's the scooting going on. He's going to like get out of the way while these other two teammates are becoming invulnerable. And so in order to become invulnerable, Hvost's Juggernaut has activated the invulnerable Blade Fury ability, which is that spinning move, and Light of Heaven's Enigma uses an item called Black King Bar in order to evade the tentacles. So the result of these carefully coordinated countermaneuvers is that only 2 of Navi's 5 heroes, Puppy's Enchantress and Art's Shadow Shaman, are stunned by the Tidehunter's ultimate ability that should have injured the entire team. So you can see in that video, the Enchantress and Shadow Shaman have like sprung up in the air and then come back down. As if the result of Navi's clever counterpicks, in-game preparation, and quick button clicks is not enough, at this moment, Faith, playing the Tidehunter, makes a critical mistake. Beyond the metagame of popular picks and bans at the International 2012, Rubik, the Grand Magus, represents a kind of metagame in and of himself. Rubik's ultimate ability, Spell Steal, allows the player to capture the last spell used by any hero in the game. Thus, Rubik is a kind of meta-hero who represents the recombinatorial possibility space of 400 different spells. The only way to guard against Rubik's ability is for an opponent to immediately follow any powerful or game-changing spell with something inconsequential, right? You have to block it, block the spell from getting stolen by doing like a small spell that won't matter. The tighter the window between the big spell and the little spell, the lower the chance of a skilled Rubik stealing the coveted spell, right? But Dendy is a very, very skilled Rubik. And instead of button mashing to prevent Dendy from stealing the Tidehunter's Ravage, Faith actually tries to reposition himself and ends up waiting just over a full second, an absolute eternity at this scale of gameplay, before attempting to block the spell steal. So, and Dendy doesn't waste any of this time. The 1.33 window of opportunity, he makes good use of it. So after dodging Ravage with his Force Staff, Dendy turns around. He's off screen right now. He very carefully and quickly disables Chuan with telekinesis at the bottom of the screen, then steals Tidehunter's ultimate ability before Faith can use another spell. And you can see right now a tiny Tidehunter start to like float diagonally through the middle. That represents the spell being stolen, right? That represents the last spell. Dendy's not sure if he's going to get an Anchor Smash or the Ravage. But at this moment, the tide finally turns. He does get the Ravage, and Navi's Enigma at the center of the screen also initiates his ability. It's kind of a counter team attack called Black Hole to gather up all of IG into one place and stun them.
Mm-hmm. So finally, Dendy, who is playing Rubik, he has to turn this purloined Ravage against IG by letting loose his stolen spell on the now tightly clustered team. So with the Chinese team paralyzed and damaged, this is where Navi quickly delivers the killing blow. The 0.46 and 1.33 second windows, these are the decisive moments. In this instance, the turn of the tide, it ceases to correlate to the human experience of spectating or even of playing Dota 2, but rather it signals a different turn altogether. So what's going on here is that Navi isn't actually delivering an act of athletic beauty, of virtuosic skill, as much as they are executing a statistical exploit. By first picking heroes with abilities that specifically counter the dominant metagame, then spamming their spells in order to rebuff that wombo combo, Navi gives Dendy room to hook the machinic undercurrent and reverse the flow of the game. So Dendy literally turns the tide. The difference between the spectacle at Benaroya Hall and the algorithmic operations of Dota 2, it dramatizes the phenomenological problem of 21st century media that Mark Hansen frames in his new book, Feed Forward. So considering the status of human experience within these vast, ubiquitous, and ultra-fast media ecologies, Hansen claims that there's been a shift in the ecology of perception, and that consciousness has lost its centrality in a world where it is no longer needed and where events occur at speeds and scales long before they manifest as contents of consciousness. So the Dota player and the Dota spectator, for that matter, who's also playing a different kind of game, they may not know exactly what's going to happen at any given moment. And their inscriptions are only retrospectively subject to analysis, like what we've done using Krukar's video. So video games are one medium in which players can sink, swim, and surf the statistical undercurrents that exist beyond the horizons of consciousness. rather than manipulating these currents directly, pro gamers and developers alike rely on these techniques not to control, but rather to surf these tides of data in order to analyze and predict the operations that exist along the vanishing point of human experience.
So in the end, although Na'Vi broke the metagame, their victory was ultimately a Pyrrhic one. So IG would go on to dominate the losers bracket and return to rematch the Ukrainians in the grand finals. And with very little fanfare and lots of careful, highly calculated plays, IG won the international in 2012. So while Na'Vi may have won the 17 seconds of battle, IG won the $1 million war. But ultimately, it was the makers of Dota 2 themselves, Valve, that conquered the world. So beyond the international tournament, there was another international game that the company had been playing for the last couple of years. Generating enthusiasm amongst Chinese players is a critical part of Valve's global strategy to expand their digital distribution platform, Steam, into other markets. And it's already estimated that 70% of all video game purchases take place through Steam. But Valve is one of the very few companies to have figured out how to make a profit in piracy-heavy markets like Russia and China. And beyond mere profit, Valve has made a business, really, of colonizing the metagame and flattening all forms of play, whether it's the work of competition, of watching, modding, or developing video games, into a single monolithic measure that Gabe Newell, one of Valve's co-founders and the de facto managing director of the company, calls productivity. So the big question is exactly, how do you design for the metagame? How can you cultivate the social dynamics around a piece of software while navigating those emergent microtemporal dynamics of video games as technical media? Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman have argued that the metagame is beyond the reach of the game designer, for it emerges from play communities and their larger social worlds. But nevertheless, since two Microsoft millionaires founded the company in 1996 after seeing a 12-person team in Mesquite, Texas outpace Windows with a new kind of productivity software, we're talking about id and Doom, right? Doom was installed in more computers than Windows at the time. Valve has been in the business of metagaming. And from the beginning, rather than focus on original IP, the company has largely concentrated on appropriating already existing yet undervalued sites of productivity from both within the industry and in the greater gaming community, starting with mods. So Team Fortress 2, for example, is a class-based multiplayer deathmatch mod originally designed in the Quake engine. And the massively popular competitive shooter Counter-Strike is a Half-Life mod. Portal's revolutionary mechanics started as a student project at DigiPen until Valve hired the entire team to adapt the gameplay to the Half-Life universe. And Dota 2 itself has an extensive history within Blizzard's Warcraft 3 before Valve hired IceFrog and Ull to remake it in the Source engine, and they're still working at Valve. So whether it's seeking out and hiring already existing but undervalued communities of modders, creating tools to facilitate the design or the trading of cosmetic items, or developing an infrastructure around games like the annual international tournament, as Gabe Newell is fond of noting, quote, "The only company we've ever met that kicks our ass is our customers." Why compete with the metagame when you can absorb and profit from it?
Right, so just to conclude, Valve's business model is based on locating those practices that exist outside the market and by commodifying relations that were previously regarded as having no exchange value. So although there's always a winner in the form of, a $10,000 Team Fortress hat or the, $1.5 million prize money from the international, there's an ocean of unremunerated activity, of unwaged work from which these moments surface and that ultimately operate as the precondition for such exchanges. So this isn't really a kind of currency, but rather an undercurrency that's driving these spectacular sports that are all taking place on the surface. So like Silvia Federici, she does an analysis of women and domestic labor. Her argument is that, these forms of domestic labor, they don't exist outside of the market, even if they're not yet quantified or subsumed basically within the sphere of exchange. You're not getting paid for doing housework. So international labor movements like wages for housework in the early 1970s, these weren't attempts to colonize domestic labor, housework, as an untapped site of production, but instead it recognized that certain kinds of invisible work have already existed and were already colonized, specifically via their exclusion from the wage. So in the same way that Federici argues that women's reproductive and affective labor were regarded as a kind of natural, unavoidable, and even fulfilling activity, so too does the perceived intrinsic value of play. So too is it exploited as a means for working without a wage. So, you know, one of the things we like to say is maybe we need wages for metagaming.
And just to wrap up, the undercurrent at the heart of the International is not the ebb and flow of Navi's mechanical turn of the tide, nor is it the tidal wave of sales in China. No, the turn of the tide is nothing less than the redefinition of metagaming from the freely chosen voluntary practice and materialist-specific embodied experience of play to the grammatized, quantified form of productivity expropriated via the design and dissemination of video game ecologies like Dota 2. So the undercurrency in which Valve traffics is not fame, it's not profit, it's not entertainment or fun, it's the metagame. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.